We'll go right into the substance of what we're going to talk about today. And the immediate context here in Albany, especially, of course, is Governor Cuomo's Tier 6 proposal. So what we're talking about today is the option of the defined contribution plan and how it relates to pension reform and some of the arguments that have made pro and con, and looking at the existing defined contribution plan that New York State has, because the defined contribution plan has been basically treated as something that is alien and disturbing and even scary. For instance, we've seen quotes like this, which generalize and say that, and refer to defined contribution plans in a blanket sense as 401ks, which are the primary employer-sponsored 401 defined contribution plan in the private sector. And basically, we've seen a series of statements by critics of the governor's plan implying that that defined contribution plans not only have flaws and downsides, but that they're completely unacceptable and don't work for anybody anywhere. Thus, for instance, the statement that they don't provide predictability and reliability of a defined benefit pension and on their own are not a viable option to retire with dignity. Or this statement, they will put workers' retirement security in danger. And of course, this statement, defined contribution plans are not adequate for retirement security of public or private workers. Now, when you read statements like this, what it leads you to believe, and I think what's intended to lead you to believe, is that really we're looking at a return to an era before Social Security. If people are in a defined contribution plan, they're looking ahead to a severe risk of having a future in retirement, of being destitute, impoverished, dependent on charity and soup kitchens, if you will, to get along because they don't have retirement security, and there's no way a defined contribution plan can require one, and so, or provide it. And so therefore, basically we're looking at a new generation of workers who will find themselves insecure and poor in their retirements, running out of money and without enough to live on, because that's the inevitable result of any defined contribution retirement plan. Now, if that's the case, we have to explain it to this guy and to her and to them. These are a random group of State University of New York faculty members, just plucked offline. On average, 3/4 of them nearly have opted into a defined contribution pension plan. So the question is, are they crazy? Do they have a terrible future in store? What were they thinking? They are part of something called the SUNY Optional Retirement Plan. Our focus today is the SUNY plan, although there's a very similar, almost identical plan in its major characteristics in existence at the City University of New York, CUNY. So I'll kind of use the phrases SUNY and CUNY and SUNY alone almost interchangeably in discussing these plans today. I should begin with a bit of elementary explanation also, just for the record, although I think this audience understands this issue better than most. A defined benefit pension plan is a plan that is funded out of a large central pool of investments and that promises a stream of income in retirement based principally on career duration and final average salary. It is explicitly designed to provide the greatest benefit to the longest duration, longest career workers. In New York State, as in most places, it's guaranteed. In fact, in New York State, unlike most states, there's a constitutional provision guaranteeing pension benefits against any diminishment or impairment, which means it is ultra secure and risk-free from the standpoint of the beneficiary. And last but not least, the benefits are generous by private sector and public sector standards. A career general employee of New York State and local government, that is someone who's not a police or firefighter, in Tier 5 can retire with a pension equivalent after 40 years of a normal 40-year working life, can retire with a pension equivalent to 77% of final average salary. Combined with Social Security income, what you've got is over 100% income replacement in retirement. So that's a pretty generous deal. A defined contribution plan is dependent on the contribution of the employee, and if it's an employer-sponsored plan, the employer. We've heard the phrase 401k and 401k-like to describe them. That's because the most prevalent plan in the private sector is the 401k. But for reasons we'll get into in a moment, that's not necessarily an apt description of what we're talking about. When did defined contribution pension plans begin? And then when did they begin in New York? Well, it started with this guy. This is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was the Warren Buffett and Bill Gates all rolled into one of the late 19th century, who made his money in steel. Incredibly wealthy. One of the most generous, if not the most generous, single philanthropists in American history. Andrew Carnegie became wealthy far beyond the bounds of anything known at the time, except with the possible exception of John D. Rockefeller, and then set about in the early 20th century giving a lot of his money away, or giving basically all of it away, and endowing various charities and foundations. One of his interests was college professors. He was on the board of trustees of Cornell. He had a great deal of respect for professors and thought they were very important to future generations, thought they were grossly underpaid, and was concerned that they had no pensions. So he gave a hunk of money, in today's terms several $100 million, to his own self-named foundation, the Carnegie Foundation for Teaching or Education, and had the foundation create a pension fund for college professors. The pension fund had a pension that sounds like a tiny amount in today's terms that actually was calibrated to be 80% of final salary. Now keep in mind, this actually is 30 years or more before Social Security. Pensions in general were not common in the private sector then, and these guys had no pensions. Well, what happened next was something that may sound familiar to anyone who follows public pensions and pensions in general today. When a pension became available from this external private fund to college professors based on their final salaries, across the country, college professors who were in this plan had their salaries escalate radically in their final year. This was the first documented instance of severe pension spiking. In almost no time, the plan was going bust. And so Carnegie, or rather in this case his foundation, had to regroup. And in short order, what happened was that the foundation decided that the solution was to create annuities. Now at that point, annuities were things largely known as were basically insurance death benefits. You died and your survivor got a payment. They conceived of doing retirement annuities to sort of mimic a pension, privately funded, that would be funded by the savings of employees during their lifetime and then annuitized at retirement to provide a stream of income, a lifetime income after retirement through the annuity, which would vary to a certain extent based on the returns of the insurance company sponsoring it. They created an entity to provide these annuities and sell them and invest the money. It was known as the Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, TIAA, and the New York State Legislature created TIAA, or chartered it, in 1918. So, almost 100 years ago, New York State essentially participated in the invention of a defined contribution plan. Over the following decades, TIAA spreads rapidly throughout the private sector of higher education. Fast forward now to 1964, and this guy, who most people will recognize, Nelson Rockefeller, is governor, and he's gearing up for one of his big priorities, which is the rapid expansion of the State University of New York. When Rockefeller took office, the State University was still a collection of small teacher colleges. What's now known as the downtown SUNY campus was the Albany SUNY, as it stood at the time, and its equivalents were what we know as the university centers today. So he was going to be expanding this thing at an extraordinarily rapid pace, the kind of pace you see these days in a place like China. He was going to hire thousands and thousands of faculty, and he was concerned that they needed to recruit faculty around the country. It's because there's a national market for college professors, and that states all across the country were ramping up and expanding their higher ed systems, and they were competing for faculty. And what college professors wanted, especially if you wanted to attract them from the private sector where they had TIAA plans, was a portable pension. So he submitted legislation, which the legislature passed, creating the optional retirement program for the State University of New York. By the way, the comptroller at the time, Arthur Levitt, submitted a memo on this. In the memo, the comptroller took no position on the bill. It says no position, followed by 2 pages of explanation of why it was objectionable. So some things never change. The principal argument, by the way, was the argument advanced for this provision is to permit job mobility. We wonder if teachers differ from any other professional or even non-professional group in this respect. Basically, the comptroller wondered why it was necessary. Well, this experience helps demonstrate why it was a good thing. Because, as you can see from the figures on the screen, the plan was very popular with SUNY faculty. Nearly 3/4 of faculty members to this day voluntarily opt into the defined contribution plan. Large majorities of the other professional and technical staff at SUNY also opt into the plan. So as you can see, there are 21,471 SUNY members, give or take, based on the data we got, who are in a defined contribution plan. Employees of the state of New York who freely chose a defined contribution plan. At CUNY, the numbers are a little different. Remember that CUNY's heritage is as a city-run municipal college and university system. And so a very large majority of what's called the classified staff at CUNY, which is the support staff, is not and has not opted into the defined contribution system. There's a strong tradition there of staying in the city pension plan, and mainly in the city employee retirement system. But otherwise, the proportions of professional and faculty choosing the optional program, which is very similar at CUNY, is similar to SUNY. There's a very large majority of the professional staff and faculty choose the optional retirement plan. Now, in both institutions, the optional retirement plan began as a plan offered solely by, there was a sole provider, a sole vendor, and that was TIAA-CREF. The CREF, which stands for College Retirement Equities Fund, was added in the 1950s when TIAA began offering variable annuities in addition to the insurance annuities that it had begun offering in the late teens and 20s. So TIAA-CREF is the sole vendor to begin with, but for the last 16 or 17 years, SUNY has had 4 vendors. In addition to TIAA-CREF, they are ING, VALIC, and MetLife. And at CUNY, the vendors offering plans are MetLife and Guardian Life. Now, what all these plans have in common, because the state legislation is written this way, is that these are not standard bare-bones mutual funds. These are annuities. That is, the primary vehicle for the investments are the annuities. The annuity during the accumulation phase is a wrapping, if you will. The whole plan is meant to point to something that will be easily, smoothly convertible to an annuity at retirement. That is, you have a hunk of money, you retire, and you convert it into an income stream which the insurance company sells you under a contract. And of course, there's a cost to this, as there is to anything in life, which is explained in our report. A majority of the employees don't choose the annuity option, but they actually depart from it. They take lump sums, but the default bias of the plan is to provide annuities, to provide something that is like a pension. Is the pension guaranteed by the taxpayers of New York? No. The pension is as strong as the financial integrity of the insurance companies that have sold the annuity contract. These all happen to be, especially in TIAA-CREF's case, but also in the other providers' cases, these are very highly rated companies. There is a backup insurance company-supported plan in the state of New York that also is meant to cover a portion of annuity values in case of an insurance insolvency. And of course, if somebody does not want to have their retirement income dependent on the health of a certain insurance company, they can simply convert to a lump sum and have it separately managed that way. So, how's the plan supported? Well, a key consideration that I can't emphasize enough in a defined contribution plan, obviously, one of the 2 key considerations is the rate of savings. How much do you put into it? How much is put into it by the employee and the employer in the case of the employer-sponsored plan? Here, the contribution rates have changed in tiers that are meant to be roughly analogous to the standard traditional defined benefit pension tiers, although they differ a bit. The contribution rates themselves are meant to mimic and sort of parallel the so-called expected long-term normal rate in the defined benefit pension plan, although those normal rates have almost never applied in any given year. They've usually been higher or lower than that. So as you can see, the oldest employees in the initial plan had an initial contribution of 12% of their first $16,500, which I think then was the Social Security tax payroll limit, and it just stayed fixed there. And then 15% on amounts above that. So the peak contribution for the oldest and the original members of the plan, tiers 1 and 2, was 15%. And actually the maximum contribution of 15% continues on the amount above $16,500 for everybody who's hired up until 1992. Since 1992, the maximum contribution is 13%. And again, the variation you see is during your first 7 years as an employee of SUNY, and CUNY has the same standards, I believe, exactly the same because it's set in state law. During your first 7 years, you contribute 3%, the employer contributes 8% for a total of 11. Then, after your first 7 years, the contribution becomes 13, and again, in rough parallel to Tier 4, after 10 years, your 3% is absorbed and added to the employer contribution. So after your 10th year, you contribute nothing, and the employer contributes 13. So the total contribution to the system for everybody hired since 1992, which is the vast majority of current SUNY and CUNY employees, by the way, is 13%. For the older employees who were hired before then, it was 15% maximum, 12 on the first 16.5 of salary. Who's eligible? There's the summary, and you'll see details in our report. You see the vesting period. This is another very important consideration. The vesting period in a Tier 5 pension right now is 10 years. That is, you must have 10 years in service before you are eligible to receive any benefit upon retirement. Now, it doesn't have to be 10 unbroken years, but it has to be 10 years. Tier 6 would convert that 10 years into 12 years for new hires. By the way, at the time Arthur Levitt wrote his memo taking no position on a bill he opposed, the vesting period then was 15 years. So long vesting periods have been generally the rule, and shorter vesting periods, as we had for a while in Tier 4, which was 5 years for a while, that's been the exception. Normally, defined benefit plans have long vesting periods. Defined contribution plans have short periods. The SUNY and CUNY plan is 1 year. That is, after 1 year, you own everything in your account going forward, what you put in and what the employer puts in. The whole thing is yours. You own it. And under the governor's plan, it would work the same way. At the end of your first year, the state would deposit fully what it owes for your first year and then make continuing deposits thereafter. You'd own it. Distributions and/or what do you get in retirement? Well, this is one of the other positive aspects of a defined contribution system for those who prefer it, especially on an optional basis, compared to defined benefit. Defined benefit systems are rigid and rule-bound, giving rise to all of the machinations in gaming that we see as the subject of newspaper stories and have forever and will forever as long as such a system exists. People are very conscious of when they're reaching the age where they can max out their benefit. There's all these games that involve double dipping, spiking, you name it, going out, coming back. And a lot of this focuses on what the retirement age is for the maximum benefit in your tier. And that is human nature. That's the incentives that are created by the system. In a defined contribution system, that's all radically diminished. Basically, the minimum retirement age for all practical purposes is 59 and a half. 55, though, actually, if you're in a plan that provides for 55. And your willingness to retire is not going to depend on any kind of special gaming or rules. It's going to depend on what you've got in the account and whether it's enough for you to get by on. If you're willing to retire and live off of and go on to do something else with what you've got in your account, you're free to go starting at these ages. That's a radically different mindset that gives rise to than in a defined benefit system. They're tax exempt from New York state taxes like a regular pension is. And there's flexible options designed to have you collected in any number of different ways. The core preference or the core model is just a lifetime annuity, but you have other options as well. Who are the providers? I think I went into this before. There's the CUNY providers. What are the advantages for the workers? Well, the advantages for the worker is the early vesting, the portability, the overall flexibility in terms of what you can do and how you can plan for your retirement. And for older employees, in many cases, not all, the death benefit, depending on what tier you'd be in if you were not there. The death benefit in a Tier 4 and 5 plan is a maximum of 3 times salary plus what contributions you made in your career with interest. Now, when you reach the end of your career, if you're in your early 60s, after a full career in state or local government in New York, the net present value of the benefit you're going to be entitled to in a defined benefit plan is very, very significant, and it's much, much more than 3 times your salary. And you basically lose a big chunk of that value if you drop dead the day before you file your papers. You get a good death benefit, but you don't get, you have a benefit if you're an employee making $60,000, $75,000 at the end of your career after 40 years, and a teacher will make 100 plus in most parts of the state, especially downstate and through this region. You're looking at a benefit that's worth well over $1 million in many cases, and you're looking at a death benefit that's worth maybe $300,000 or $400,000. So it's a huge deal. In a defined contribution plan, you own it. What's in your account, and we'll see in a moment how much is in those accounts, you have a big chunk of money. The whole thing belongs to your heirs and survivors or designated beneficiaries. If you don't have to worry about dropping dead on your way to put your papers in at the comptroller's office, which a lot of people quite sensibly and naturally do once it dawns on them what they're looking at when they get ready to retire from state and local government. What are the disadvantages? They're obvious. There's obvious disadvantages. There's a trade-off here. First of all, there's the lack of the taxpayer guarantee. This is as close to a completely risk-free good deal as you can find on the planet. If you're willing to chain yourself to a desk or a truck or some other kind of job in state or local government in New York for 40 years, you can't possibly beat this if you're concerned about risk. You can't. The taxpayers have to back this to the hilt no matter what. Also, the benefit, depending on what tier you're being compared with in the defined benefit system, the benefit will be lower in a defined contribution system on average, depending on investment performance, which is the other big variable. Not much lower, but lower, depending on the tier, than the defined benefit. Now, Tier 6 would be a little different, so we'll get to this in a minute. The Tier 6 benefit, a defined contribution plan, properly funded on the contribution level, could be competitive with on a career-long basis, depending on under an average investment scenario. Now, I wanted to illustrate the portability difference because this is why those crazy SUNY professors opted into this plan. Let's take somebody, let's look at year 8 here. These are several examples, and they're repeated in our report, Table 2. You're somebody, a lot of teachers move on early in their careers, as Tim Creamer knows. You're a teacher, and after 8 years, you say, I've had it with this. I want to, or you say, my wife's got a great job offer in North Carolina. We really have to move. And you're gone. You're out of the system. Well, this chart shows what you can take out of these two systems. And as you can see, if you're an ERS, you take $13,000 out. This is, again, there's basic assumptions here. You start at a $40,000 job. You have 3% average wage inflation. You've been making the contributions required by ERS and TRS, which are different, which is why these are shown this way. This is Tier 5. You can take out 13 or you can take out 15, depending on which system you're in. If you're in the SUNY ORPS plan with that, remember, 11% contribution your first 7 years and 13th the 8th, you're walking away with $48,827. Now, here's where the difference comes in. If you're looking ahead, if you're thinking about your retirement, and you're looking at your career, you're looking at what's saved for retirement, your career is something that you want to be part of your retirement, look at this difference. If you invest what you can withdraw from the defined benefit system, 30 years later, assuming a 5% rate of return, which is what the comptroller and the TRS will pay you on your contribution. If we have 5% average returns over the next 30 years, by the way, all of the defined benefit systems melt down because they assume 7.5 to 8. 5% return. You get 56 if you're in the ERS, out of that ERS nest egg. You get 65 30 years later out of the TRS. But 30 years later, what's that hunk of money you took away worth? $211,000. That is a big difference. That is why portability matters. If you're not convinced you want to spend a career in government, or in fact you know you don't want to spend a career in government, there's no question which plan is better. That's why so many SUNY professors choose it, because ambitious professors want to be free to take a job that opens at the University of Wisconsin or at Texas A&M or Kenyon, or you name it. Ohio State, I don't know about, that's a community college in the state capital of Ohio, isn't it? Now, what are the advantages for taxpayers of the DC plan? The advantages are clear. Transparency, the financial transparency is unparalleled. You have a contribution rate Every paycheck, you put in that money, and you're done. What are our employees costing us? They're costing us this much, period. The defined benefit plan, by contrast, is incredibly opaque. To work as well as it does for the people it works well for, it's extraordinarily complex and opaque and unpredictable. Transparency and predictability are unparalleled benefits of a DC system for taxpayer employers. Also, certain types of employees will be more attracted to it, and you will have more success attracting them. Those who, for instance, want flexibility but are willing, are interested in giving a try to working for some form of public agency for a few years. What are the disadvantages? A plan that's adequately funded because of the way government accounting standards basically allow defined benefit systems in New York and elsewhere to sort of fallaciously set their so-called normal rate too low, which is a whole other story we won't get to today. The recurring cost of making what is a truly adequate contribution, if you put it at the SUNY level, to the SUNY plan, is higher than what's normally called the expected long-term rate of a defined benefit plan. Keep in mind, that is never the rate that's actually charged. It has the expected long-term rate of Tier 4, which was, for Tier 4 employees, which was 11%, has ranged during the life of the Tier 4 generation from near zero to heading toward 23% in the next few years. What can you save in a standard sort of TIA-CREF style plan? This is just for TIA-CREF. It could apply to any provider. Well, there's two ways of looking at this. One, which is a helpful and interesting way, but has its shortcomings, is let's just make assumptions about smooth average returns, average salaries, average returns over your career. If you start your career at the age of 25 in a $45,000 a year job at SUNY or CUNY and go into one of these plans, for the sake of this illustration, this is not actually the SUNY plan. This is assuming a level 12% total contribution between employer and employee. Well, and you make 6% a year. Now again, 6% a year is less than the pension funds assume they will make in order to make their calculations work. If you make 6% a year, by the time you reach retirement age of 65, which actually, for most of us in the room, is either 66 or 67, for Social Security purposes, you will basically have accumulated $1.3 million, which can translate into income replacement of 73%, which is actually better than Tier 6 will give you. The big variable, of course, is, well, will you realize an annualized average return of 6%? And if it's an annualized average return of 6%, is it actually an average of 12% early in your career and very little late in your career? That will make a difference because the percentage is being compounded of a rising salary level. Here are the actual and projected accumulations for actual people in the SUNY plan, which is part of a sample of the data that we present in the report and which we were able to pull together with the help of TIAA-CREF and the SUNY and CUNY administrations. So as you can see, these are people who are in the plan. What does this show, basically? Faculty members and other administrators and professional staff who are in the defined contribution plan at SUNY, who are the oldest and most long-tenured members, have average accumulations of well over $1 million and are looking at having very high wage replacement rates under either a slow growth scenario or an even stronger growth scenario. And again, we made assumptions going forward very conservative. The top table here, that's 4%. That assumes that the annualized return on an investment and both in the accumulation phase and the annuity phase is only 4%. If that is the actual growth in a standard retirement account in the next 10 years, remember, the defined pension benefit funds are going to melt down even further because that's slow growth. But if that's the average growth, this is what they will have. As you go down in age, the accumulation translated into an average pay replacement goes down because the youngest pre-retirement group, the guys who are in their, men and women in their late 50s, who've spent their entire careers working for SUNY, they have average accounts right now, accumulations of $566,000. If we have slow growth from now until the end of their lives, they will be replacing 50% of their final salaries. With Social Security, that will be equivalent to about 70% replacement, which used to be something of a benchmark. Now there's argument in the field fluctuating high and low on that basis. So under a pessimistic scenario, the poorest, relatively, of the people in the TIA plan are situated in that manner with the others in between. Almost all of these people, I think it's not an overstatement, Dave, have 457 deferred comp plans that they put into in addition to this. A lot of them. Or a 403B. They have supplemental savings plans that a lot of them have other money in. Almost no one is dependent entirely on this. Because their contribution rates are so low, they had a strong incentive to put into the supplemental plan. Okay, what does the governor's plan look like? The governor's plan has two pieces. He is saying that the standard mandatory floor would be a 4% employer contribution to which you, the employee, would add nothing, for a combined rate of 4%. And by the way, the bill is written to include SUNY and CUNY in that. That's a huge step down. Then it says, in a 401k style, it says 4% employer, but we'll match 3% from you in addition to that if you want to put in 3. In that case, the total contribution would be 10. Now, there's technical issues with this. A 401k is a private sector beast, unless you're in a so-called grandfather plan, which we're not in a state government. There's no such thing as a 401k in government. A 401k has contributions that vary. You can change what you put in, and the employer can change what he puts in. What SUNY and CUNY have are what's known as a 401A plan. A 401A plan is an employer-sponsored government plan in which the contribution is fixed. The plan can allow some variation according to specific rules, but there's not what are called elective elements, where either the employer or the employee sort of changes repeatedly or even once what they're willing to put into the plan. So it's technically the whole contribution comes from the employer, and then the employer technically, but only technically, covers the employee share. But there's not the variation in a 401k plan. This actually further strengthens the plan from the employee's standpoint quite a bit. So what the governor's proposing actually cannot be done in a 401A plan. It could be done in a combination of a 401A for the top part and a 457 or something for the bottom part, or it could be done as simply a 457 alone, I think, or we'll get into the numbers, but a combination of two different types of plan. But it cannot be done in a 401A. Now, for reasons explained in the report, we suggest that this contribution level be increased, and that to a minimum of a total of 12%. And that the employee share be according to the same rules that the governor has proposed on the defined benefits side of Tier 6, which would mean that the employer share would vary from 6% to 8%, depending on the employee share, so that the total plan put was 12%. Now, arguments can be made for more than that. But remember, when you say, if you look at this and say, well, 6 to 8%, what is the Tier 6 cost compared to that? Well, the actuarial long-term expected normal cost of a Tier 6 plan for a general employee has been estimated by the Comptroller's actuary at 4.7%. Now, again, that's under accounting rules that grossly understate the actual cost based on the actual size of the benefit, but that's the way the rules work. So this costs, heavily quoted, advised, more than DB. However, I would point out that at the peak of this range, it costs less than Tier 5 and a lot less than Tier 4. And it's level and predictable and transparent. So this is not unreasonable. And in fact, I think if employee advocates and unions would take this seriously, where they should be engaging is on this number. Instead of saying and shouting no, they should be saying more. Now, there's plan design issues on which the governor's plan is almost completely silent. The things to consider, and that again we sort of suggest in the report, that there be the same annuity preference as at SUNY CUNY, where you'd still have the flexibility to cash out at the end if you want to, but that it be built around annuity so that somebody, an employee who values the flexibility, who wants to be in a defined contribution plan, but who otherwise wants to set it and forget it and not wake up finding him or herself without security, can be in the annuity and it's over. Have plan provider competition, have fairly priced investment choices, default to life cycle funds. Right now the flaw in many 401ks and in the existing SUNY plan at present is that if you choose the plan but then don't make any other choices, you just won't fill out the forms and can't be bothered, your money will default into a money market account, which is practically like a passbook savings account. You make absolutely nothing off it. So the default should be something like a life cycle fund, which is meant to be a mix of investments based on your age and your career prospects. You need transparency on fee and expenses, and we should have consumer benchmarks independent that are used to rate the plan. I cite here something called Brightscope. If you go to www.brightscope.com, that's a consumer service that rates defined contribution plans on a variety of criteria, and it's quite highly thought of. It rates the SUNY plan, by the way, mixed. It rates it as being very good on low cost, among the lowest cost plans, but rates it poorly on investment options, at least as of a year or two ago. So we're left again to confront this statement. And this statement, again, has been made in different ways by a lot of people involved in this debate. And what this statement implies is there's simply no way anybody can have a proper, respectable, secure, dignified retirement if they have a defined contribution plan. No way. And in closing, I would suggest to you that if you look at the plans that the state has at SUNY and CUNY, the experience with those plans basically refutes that argument, which is why most of these people are actually in that kind of plan. So with that, I'll yield to our other speakers.